Hey everybody, so this is going to be a quick video over the second type of selection, and that's sexual selection. Now, sexual selection is a more direct path for traits to move into the next generation. Specifically, sexual selection is the process, and really it's two processes. So the processes whereby those who have certain traits have an easier time of mating. And so because they have an easier time of mating, they're more likely to have children, and those children are more likely to have their traits. So again, like I said, sexual selection is really two processes. The first is intersexual selection. I-N-T-E-R. In fact, let me show you the screen so you can. There you go. All right. So the first is I-N-T-E-R, sexual selection. This is the process whereby those members of one sex that have the traits the opposite sex want get to reproduce more. All right. Although men and women have by far mostly the same preferences and mates, there are some sex differences. So for example, women tend to prefer low body fat percentages in men, whereas men actually prefer slightly higher body fat percentages in women. So, for example, a body fat percentage of about 14% in a guy may be attractive, whereas a body fat percentage of 24% might be attractive in a girl. And I realize those are a little high on the range if you were to look it up, but there's a sex difference. One of probably the most consistent sex difference is the difference in body shapes. Men tend to prefer women who have a waist to hip ratio of about 0.7, meaning men tend to, around the world, prefer women whose waist is about 70% as wide as their hips, so wider hips than waist. Whereas women tend to prefer men with a waist to hip ratio of 1, meaning the waist and hips are about the same width. That's a sex difference. So men who have a waist to hip ratio closer to 1 and who have lower body fat percentages tend to be preferred by more women than are men who have a waist to hip ratio of, let's say, over 1, so their waist is wider than their hips, or much less than 1, so their waist is smaller than their hips. All right, so those men with that 1-to-1 ratio, that preferred ratio, are going to be more successful at attracting ladies than are men who don't have that ratio. In the same way, women who have a hip to waist ratio closer to the ideal of a waist being about 70% as wide as the hips, and a slightly higher body fat percentage. And the obsession with body fat percentage isn't as dire as it's often depicted to be. On average, like I said, men actually do prefer higher body fat percentages, but that's a discussion for another video. Women who have slightly higher body fat percentages, women who have the waist to hip ratio closer to that ideal of 0.7, they tend to have an easier chance of getting men than do women who have a body fat percentage that's much lower or much higher than that, or a waist to hip ratio that's much lower or much higher than that. All right, so this is intersexual competition. This is when traits of one sex are preferred by the other, and those members of that sex that have the preferred traits, they tend to be more successful at getting mates and therefore reproducing. So between, you can think of it like an interstate highway. An interstate highway goes between states. Interstate sexual selection goes between sexes. Okay, but there's also intrasexual competition. This is competition within the sex. Now, the competition is for the opposite sex, but it's still competition within the sex. So you might, the prototypical image that you might have seen in textbooks is textbooks of two deer, you know, slamming heads together. You know, the classic example from 80s and 90s movies is that guy in the mall who says, "You looking at my girlfriend?" Right? So that competition between members of the same sex to excel specifically in a domain that the opposite sex cares about. All right. So one of the most reliable sex differences around the planet is that women tend to prefer, at least more than men do, in men, access to resources. Men tend to not care much about that particular trait in women. And so, again, intrasexual competition, members of the same sex competing with one another in a domain that the opposite sex cares about. All right. So since women care about access to resources, men tend to compete for access to resources. And sometimes this can take the shape of displaying resources. So this might be why men wear name brand clothing, why they might, you know, drive name brand, or not name brand, but expensive cars, why they are so showy. All right. Male humans are showy. They engage in showy behavior, right? They show off in the same way that male birds have those. If you ever study birds, male birds are the ones that have the pretty colors. Female birds are the ones that are a little bit more drably colored. All right. The males are showing off. All right. They're showy. Male humans are the same way. We're showy. All right. But again, we're showy because we're trying to display the thing that the opposite sex wants. And so men will compete in the domain of access to resources because that's the domain that women tend to care about. Now, women will compete in a domain they'll compete with each other in a domain that men care about. You may have heard the expression that women dress up for each other more than they dress up for men. And while that's not 100% certain true, there is some truth to that statement, because men care about physical attractiveness on average more than women do. Women absolutely care about it. Women absolutely care about how physically attractive their partners are, but men care about it on average more. And so women tend to compete with each other in that domain. So again, women competing with each other in the domain of physical attractiveness, men competing with each other in the domain of access to resources. The competition with each other is intrasexual competition. They're competing within the sex in the same way that an intrastate highway only goes around the state, right? So if you get on an intrastate highway, you're not leaving the state on that highway, all right? Intrasexual competition, you get competition within the sex. Yes, the domain that intrasexual competition occurs in is dictated by the trait that the opposite sex wants, all right? So you might see that we might expect that as the preferences of one sex shifts across generation, the competition in that domain in the opposite sex would shift. All right. And that is sexual selection. Those are the two processes of sexual selection. Again, we have intersexual competition, where members of one sex try to possess the traits the opposite sex wants, and that's intersexual competition. And intrasexual competition, where members of the same sex compete with one another for access to the opposite sex. All right, guys, that's it for this video. As always, if you have any questions, send them my way. If not, have a great one, and I'll see you next time.